All right, sorry for that little glitch. So hi, everyone. This presentation is going to be sort of a personal journey between the fuzzy boundaries of art design and cartography. So I'm attracted to maps largely for the reason that I think a lot of people are. They compress big, complicated parts of the world, or in this case, the entire world, onto tiny surfaces. And this gives me the empowering feeling of fully knowing a place, symbolically bringing faraway lands, or as in my title of this talk, the places beyond within my grasp. So this might be a bit controversial, but to me, some real places feel like maps even before they're put on paper. Because they're microcosms of much bigger places. And I think of these as lived maps. And I think the best examples are small islands that compress huge amounts of climatic and ecological diversity into tiny areas, contrasts that are usually associated with entire continents. And so if we agree that real places can be maps, I find these lived maps to be the most empowering kinds because I can inhabit them. And this feeling of having the world at my fingertips is more than just symbolic. Small volcanic cones and craters have a similar effect for me. Most of us think of volcanoes as usually being unapproachable and overpowering, but these you can easily access and explore, particularly when they're marooned within cities. So for me, volcanoes and compressed climate zones are the most powerful types of lived maps. But there's some other kinds, such as islands of green in the middle of the desert, islands of rock in a salt pan, not a very common example, but pretty striking, and islands of rainforest in the middle of the city. So I experience all of these places to some degree as normally massive and overwhelming places that are being compressed and sharpened into something distinct and comprehensible. So I was lucky to visit a number of these lived maps starting as a teenager and in college. After exploring these compressed places in real life, I still had the urge to compress and structure them further. And I had done some form of art for my entire life. So I realized that this could be one way to satisfy this urge. So this is in Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. The clouds are hiding it here, but the rim of the crater is actually covered in cloud forest. The floor of the crater is savanna, and the exterior of this mountain is largely semi-desert. So in this painting, I compressed all of this ecological diversity into an ecological map of sorts, with made up of perspective views. And I think of it as sort of a lived map intensified into a 2D map. About a year later, I used even more abstraction to depict this imaginary island as a fully knowable kind of miniature world unto itself. And you'll see that this fractured style would become an archetype for what was to come later. So my obsession with these compressed, miniaturized places, along with some other interests, led me to the field of landscape architecture. And these are some study models and later some sketches that I did mostly in grad school, but also early in private practice. And you'll see the island and volcano theme going here. And some oases too. But after some time working in the field, in the real world, I realized that I'd have limited opportunities to actually create these lived maps. So I decided to pick up where I left off, creating intensified versions of these lived maps in 2D. And to do that, I began by experimenting with combining photos that I had taken, starting with my early travels, combining them into photo montages that are inspired by those earlier paintings that you saw. So these two source images happen to be from the wettest and driest places in the USA. But here I've combined them so that they're only a few steps apart. And this place is, of course, not real, but the point is that I'd like to think it could be. So this wet-dry contrast is created by a rainfall gradient. This one is in the form of a desert oasis. And this mountain in Curacao is the only place in the world where these palms grow. And so I wanted to accentuate the isolation and specialness of this place by turning the mountain into an island. So these photomontages can't be printed very large. Most of them are made up of just scans of 3.5 by 5 prints, so the resolution is pretty bad. But I wanted to go up in size just to be able to draw the viewer kind of more strongly into the experience. So I started reinterpreting these photomontages in oil paints. And these longer ones are about 7 or 8 feet long. This one's 4 foot by 4 foot, which is one of the smaller ones. So around the time that I decided to take a break from landscape architecture, which was about 4 years ago, I missed the precision that came with designing. And so I took a bit of a detour, and I started to create this series of lived maps, focusing purely on plan view in watercolor, and combining the watercolors with laser cut and laser etched plexiglass to represent topography. The painting in the upper left, you'll remember from a few minutes ago. Seabiscuit Island is meant to represent how I imagine that place looking from the air. And you may remember that the upper slice of that painting is inspired by Death Valley. And the aerial image in the lower left is actually an aerial view of what that piece of Death Valley actually looks like. It's an eroded cinder cone that's been split in half by a fault line. So that served as the inspiration. That form served as the inspiration for Seabiscuit Island. This one was inspired by volcanoes in Iceland, and you can see I've layered the plexiglass in this case to represent topography in 3D. This is another Iceland-inspired work. One of the first ones that I did, focusing on the juxtaposition between urban and wild. This one was actually inspired by a dream that I had after visiting places like the ones shown in the upper left. And literally in the dream, I found myself standing in the middle of this volcanic urban park, which I had mostly designed in my head, apparently. But after this detour into aerial views, I decided to get back to emphasizing the experience of actually being in these places. Truer to the lived maps that they're meant to accentuate. And I did that by merging multiple landscapes together, as I had done in the oils and the photomontages. So this latest current series of work is in this fractured style, still in watercolor, because I find it to be better at representing natural textures. And I keep some of the aerial components still, as you can see. So the combined landscape and aerial views are usually based on my own photography and on satellite imagery. This one's an exception because it was inspired by a dream. But almost all of the landscape fragments in these works come from my direct experiences of real places and my own photography. Most recently, it's not just the fragments that are based on real places, but the overall places that are depicted by the works as a whole. With varying degrees of idealization and accentuation. Recently, I've been calling these works worldviews because they express the way that I view the world in spatial rather than scenic terms. A landscape that I'm currently in has little meaning to me unless I can experience the edge of it and what lies beyond it, as if I'm simultaneously in the place and viewing it from the air. Each of these, I also use the term worldviews because each of them represents a complete multidimensional world, the full experience of a place, rather than just one landscape at a time, or just a pure bird's eye perspective. And in fact, as spatial representations, I don't really think of these as paintings at all. In fact, painting each of these individual fragments to me it's something I just kind of want to get over with. I'm much more engaged by the act of designing the map, of figuring out the relationships between the pieces. So to get more deeply into a few of these, Rangitoto is a volcanic island, just a short boat ride away from downtown Auckland. As you can see, Lower elevations are dry and rugged, but as you climb toward the summit, which is at about 250 meters and a little less than an hour hike, the landscape becomes more rainforest-like, including in the crater itself, which you can see across in the upper right there. So to me, this is a really good example of one of these lived maps because of this ecological diversity compressed into such a small area, the fact that it's a miniaturized volcano, easily accessible, and the fact that you have this such a strong urban wild contrast. And in the worldview, I decided to accentuate all of these things, including bringing the island closer to the city and surrounding it by city on all sides. This is another New Zealand volcano on the North Island. Another good example of a lived map because it has such a clear, identifiable structure to it, both between the park and the surrounding fields. What you're seeing there is the forest that's been preserved inside the park boundary in that perfect circle. And also the ecological zonation within the park, which you can see pretty well in both of these images. So here's the rainforest at the base of the volcano. And as you climb, that grades into shrubland and finally alpine grassland and bare rock and snow at the top. So most of these works I think of as wanderings, sort of just the eye just kind of wanders across the boundaries, but from one landscape to the next. There's not really one clear directional path, but some of these works do represent linear journeys. This one travels across another particularly dramatic wet-dry gradient. This one you can actually find in the map gallery. And here is the actual journey that I took, about 6 or 7 hours across this gradient. This one's more of an oasis, but still actually created by moisture from above rather than from below. This is the foothills of the Andes in the Peruvian desert. The hills are just high enough to intersect the fog layer. So you get this amazingly green, almost fluorescently green oasis in the middle of the desert. So I'll take you on a journey through this park. It begins on the Pan American Highway in the barren desert. Literally nothing grows there at all. As you climb very gradually, you start to see vegetation, still very low and brown, but it becomes taller and greener as you head uphill. And after about an hour and a half, you enter the heart of the oasis. Then you rise above that to the ridgeline where you can overlook and see the desert again on the other side. This was actually at the tail end of the fog season that I was here. So the green part of the oasis is actually reduced in size from what it is earlier in the year. And so the ridgeline is ostensibly above the fog layer at this point. So it's brown again. So here is another view along the ridgeline, and then you loop back down into the oasis itself with views back down toward the desert in the direction you came from. So this is a view of the same place. It's not my photo, or it's a photo of somebody else's photo that was taken actually at the height of the fog season, when the green actually extends up and over the ridgeline. And I'd really like to return here for what would be the third time to investigate this incredible contrast and compression of landscapes even further. But I have a feeling it's not going to look like this for much longer. I would expect that climate change is going to have a pretty profound effect on the fog patterns in this area. It's not coincidental that the places I experience as lived maps like this, with complex ecological patterns and tiny natural relics, are particularly susceptible to climate change and other environmental threats. So there might seem to be a conflict between my wanting to feel this sense of empowerment over these lived maps by shrinking them further in 2D. Conflict between that and preserving them as they are. But I've realized that this urge to further bring lived maps within my grasp and control is actually a protective impulse. So thanks, and I'd love to have some conversations about these ideas, so please talk to me later, send me an email, visit my website, and if you do that, please check out my blog where I get into some more depth with these ideas, and also look at some issues, some broader issues relating to design and conservation. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was beautiful. And I think the members of the audience also agree. For the sake of time, I think we'll just move on to our next talk.